Congratulations are in order, Natalie announced, her manicured hand resting on her visibly pregnant belly as she appeared beside our table at Cypress Grill. Ryan's going to be a father. The crystal champagne flute froze halfway to my lips as my husband's face drained of color. 15 years of marriage shattered in 6 devastating words at what was supposed to be our anniversary celebration. The carefully selected wine, a rare Pinot Noir from the Willamette Valley, suddenly tasted like vinegar in my mouth. But what Ryan and his pregnant mistress didn't realize was that by dessert, I would dismantle the elaborate medical fraud scheme they'd been orchestrating together, and their futures would collapse as spectacularly as my marriage. If you're just joining us, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. If this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's video reveals how a nurse exposed a dangerous surgeon with a single hidden recording. I set my glass down with practiced calm, years of delivering difficult diagnoses to parents in my pediatric practice serving me well in this moment. Please, Natalie, join us, I said, gesturing to the empty chair at our table. Since you've made yourself part of our anniversary, you might as well sit down. Ryan's eyes darted between us, panic evident in the tight lines around his mouth, the same tell he'd had since we met in medical school 17 years ago. Kate, I can explain, he began, his voice taking on that authoritative tone he used, with residents and nurses alike. I'm sure you can, I replied evenly, my hand steady as I reached for my purse. You've always been excellent at explanations, haven't you? Almost as good as you are at falsifying patient treatment records. Natalie settled into the chair, triumphant smile faltering slightly at my unexpected composure. At 32, she was 11 years younger than me, a fact Ryan had clearly appreciated when he hired her as the new finance director for his cardiology department last spring. What she didn't know was that she was walking into a trap 6 months in the making. How far along are you? I asked, nodding toward her midsection, the black designer maternity dress highlighting her condition perfectly. 6 months, she replied, her hand protectively cradling her belly. Due in February. I nodded thoughtfully. February. So conception would have been around the time of the Seattle Medical Conference, the one where Ryan gave that moving keynote about ethical standards in cardiac care. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. Ryan shifted uncomfortably, reaching for his water glass. His Rolex, a gift from me when he became department head, caught the light. Kate, this isn't how I wanted you to find out. I was going to tell you. After the baby was born? I interrupted. Or perhaps after you finished transferring hospital funds to those offshore accounts. Which revelation were you planning first, Ryan? The water glass stopped halfway to his lips, his knuckles whitening around the crystal stem. Natalie's confident demeanor cracked visibly, confusion flashing across her features. I don't know what you're talking about, Ryan said, but the slight tremor in his voice betrayed him. 15 years of marriage had taught me every micro-expression, every subtle tell when he was lying. Creating and narrating this story took considerable effort, so if you're enjoying it, please consider subscribing to our channel. It really helps us bring more content like this to you. Now, let's get back to what happened next. I think you do, I said quietly, reaching into my purse to withdraw a sealed envelope, placing it carefully on the crisp white tablecloth. Just like you know about the falsified cardiac treatment protocols, the insurance fraud, and the 3 patients who died after receiving unnecessary procedures in your department. Natalie's face lost its rosy glow as she turned to Ryan. What is she talking about? I felt a momentary pang of sympathy for her. Had she known what she was getting involved in? Or was she simply another pawn in Ryan's elaborate game? Either way, she was about to learn the truth. Perhaps you should ask Ryan about Linda Garvey, age 52, who died after an unnecessary stent procedure last April. Or Michael Chen, 48, whose minor arrhythmia was treated with an experimental procedure that resulted in cardiac arrest. Both had recently updated their insurance policies at the recommendation of their trusted doctor. The restaurant's ambient noise seemed to fade away, the soft clink of silverware, murmured conversations, and gentle piano music all receding, as our private drama intensified. From the corner of my eye, I noticed the maitre d' giving a subtle nod. The security cameras I'd requested be activated were capturing everything. "These are outrageous accusations," Ryan hissed, leaning forward, his mask of composure slipping further. "You can't possibly have evidence?" I finished for him. "Like the backup copies of patient files before you altered them? Or perhaps the recording of you instructing Natalie on how to reroute insurance payments through the department's research fund?" A waiter approached our table with practiced discretion, carrying another envelope on a silver tray. "As requested, Dr. Mitchell," he said, presenting it to me with a slight bow. Ryan's eyes narrowed. "What's going on, Kate? What are you doing?" I opened the first envelope slowly, methodically, the way Ryan had taught me to approach complicated diagnoses years ago when we were still partners in every sense of the word. "I'm doing what I've always done, Ryan. I'm protecting my patients." From the envelope, I withdrew a series of documents, medical records, bank statements, and a USB drive that made Natalie's perfectly glossed lips part in shock. "What is this?" she whispered. "Evidence," I replied simply. 6 months of it, starting from the day I noticed the unusual mortality rate in cases where you used that new, accelerated protocol you developed. Memories flashed through my mind, the late nights reviewing patient files, the meetings with Marcus Williams, the private investigator I'd hired after finding discrepancies in the department's financial reports, the carefully documented pattern of deaths following procedures that should have been routine. "Your department's mortality rate for routine cardiac procedures jumped 278% after you implemented your innovative approach," I continued, laying out the documents one by one. "Meanwhile, your personal finances improved dramatically. The lake, house in Cannon Beach, the new Tesla, the private flight lessons, all funded by insurance payouts from patients who died under your care." Natalie pushed back from the table, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "I don't know anything about this," she insisted, panic rising in her voice. "I just manage the departmental accounts based on the directives I'm given." "The directives to move funds through 7 different accounts before they landed in an offshore holding company?" I asked, my voice gentle despite the damning nature of my words. "The same company that purchased your condo last month?" Her hand flew to her throat, fingers brushing against the diamond pendant that hung there. A gift from Ryan, no doubt. "That was a legitimate bonus," she stammered, "for streamlining the department's financial processes." "It certainly streamlined something," I agreed, turning my attention back to Ryan, whose confident demeanor had given way to barely controlled panic. "Though I don't think the hospital board or the insurance companies will see it that way." Ryan's hand slammed down on the table, rattling the fine china and drawing glances from nearby diners. "Enough. You've created an elaborate fantasy based on coincidences and misunderstandings. You're an excellent pediatrician, Kate, but you know nothing about cardiac care or hospital finance." "You're right," I acknowledged, opening the second envelope the waiter had delivered. "That's why I consulted with Dr. Thomas Green from Northwestern and Dr. Sarah Bennett from Johns Hopkins. They reviewed all your cases from the past 2 years. Would you like to know their conclusions?" The color drained from Ryan's face completely. Thomas Green had been his mentor in medical school. Sarah Bennett was the leading authority on the cardiac procedures Ryan claimed to have improved. "This ends now," Ryan said, his voice low and dangerous as he reached for the documents. "You're making accusations that could destroy careers." "Careers should be destroyed when they're built on dead patients," I replied, holding the papers just out of his reach. "But don't worry, I've provided copies to everyone who needs them. The Hospital Ethics Committee, the State Medical Board, the insurance companies, and the families of every patient who died under your care." Just then, my phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced down to see it was from Marcus. FBI agents in position. Green light whenever you're ready. This deep into our story, I appreciate you staying with us. If the content is valuable to you, hitting that subscribe button helps us reach more people with these important real-life accounts. Natalie stood suddenly, her face ashen. I need to use the restroom, she mumbled, clutching her purse to her chest. Of course, I replied, nodding to the female figure who had been sitting discreetly at the bar, an FBI agent who would ensure Natalie didn't dispose of any evidence or make any warning calls. It's just past the bar on the left. As she hurried away, Ryan leaned across the table, his voice a harsh whisper. Do you have any idea what you've done? The research we're doing is revolutionary. Yes, there are risks, but the potential benefits? Save it for your lawyer, I cut him off. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The revolutionary research excuse might work if any of your procedures were actually part of approved clinical trials, or if the patients had been properly informed of the risks, or if you weren't pocketing the insurance money when they died. I spread out more documents across the table, charts showing the correlation between procedures, deaths, and insurance payouts, bank statements tracing the movement of funds, emails between Ryan and Natalie discussing how to manage the financial aspects of certain high-risk cases. I did it for us, Ryan said, his voice breaking slightly. The department needed funding. The new techniques could save lives. We just needed more time, more resources. And the lake house? The Tesla? The private flying lessons? I asked quietly. Were those necessary research expenses too? Before he could answer, Natalie returned, her makeup freshly applied but unable to hide her distress. Ryan, we need to leave, now. Her voice was urgent, fearful. I'm afraid that won't be possible, I said as two men in suits approached our table, their badges visible at their belts. Agents Miller and Thompson have some questions about your financial activities. Dr. Ryan Mitchell? The taller agent asked, though it was clearly a formality. We need you to come with us to answer some questions regarding allegations of insurance fraud and financial impropriety. Ryan stood up so quickly his chair toppled backward. This is absurd. I'm one of the most respected cardiologists in the Pacific Northwest. You can't just... We have a warrant, Dr. Mitchell, the second agent interrupted, displaying the document. And we've already secured your office and files at Westlake Memorial. As the agents read Ryan his rights, the maitre d' approached me discreetly. Dr. Mitchell, would you prefer to continue this discussion somewhere more private? I shook my head. No need. I believe our anniversary dinner has concluded. I gathered my things calmly, watching as Ryan was escorted toward the exit, his once commanding presence diminished by the agents flanking him. Natalie remained frozen in place, one hand on her pregnant belly, the other gripping the back of her chair for support. What happens to me? She asked, her voice barely audible. That depends on what you knew and when you knew it, I replied, honestly. If you cooperate fully, the authorities may be lenient. After all, you're not the first person Ryan has manipulated, though you may be the last. I stood to leave, pausing beside her. For what it's worth, I believe you didn't know the full extent of what was happening. Ryan has always been very good at compartmentalizing information and making people see only what he wants them to see. Outside Cypress Grill, the cool Portland night air filled my lungs as I took my first deep breath in what felt like hours. The city lights reflected in puddles from an earlier rain shower, creating mirrors of the world above. For the first time since discovering Ryan's betrayal, both personal and professional, I felt a strange sense of peace settling over me. The truth was finally out. Dr. Mitchell? A voice called from behind me. Agent Miller approached, his expression solemn. We'd appreciate it if you could come to the field office tomorrow morning to give a formal statement." "Of course," I replied, pulling my coat tighter against the chill. "I have all the original documents and recordings in a secure location. I'll bring everything with me." He nodded appreciatively. "The evidence you've gathered is substantial. If it's as comprehensive as it appears, Dr. Mitchell won't be practicing medicine again." "And the patients? Their families?" I asked, the faces of those who had died under Ryan's care flashing through my mind. "The U.S. attorney is already preparing to contact them. There will likely be a victim compensation fund established from seized assets." He handed me his card. "We'll see you tomorrow, 9 a.m. As his car pulled away, I realized I was alone on the sidewalk, truly alone for the first time in 15 years. No Ryan, no shared home to return to, just the truth I'd uncovered and the consequences now unfolding. I called a rideshare to take me to the small apartment I'd rented 3 months ago after discovering the extent of Ryan's schemes. I hadn't told him I'd moved out some of my belongings, maintaining the appearance of our perfect marriage while quietly building my case. Each night I'd returned to our house, played the role of devoted wife, and silently gathered more evidence. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Sarah Bennett. "Just heard from Agent Thompson. You did the right thing, Kate. Call me when you're ready to talk about next steps." Sarah had been more than just a consultant on the medical aspects of Ryan's fraud. She'd become a friend and ally, understanding immediately what was at stake when I'd first reached out to her with my suspicions. The car arrived at my apartment building, a converted warehouse in the Pearl District, with exposed brick walls and large windows. It wasn't as luxurious as the West Hills home I'd shared with Ryan, but it was honest, paid for with my own salary, filled with only the possessions that truly mattered to me. Inside, I kicked off my heels and poured myself a glass of the scotch I'd been saving. My reflection in the window showed a woman I barely recognized. Composed, determined, unwavering. The Kate Ryan had married had been younger, more trusting, eager to believe in the fundamental goodness of people, especially those who took the Hippocratic Oath. That Kate was gone, transformed by betrayal and the horrific discovery that the man she'd loved had been deliberately harming patients for profit. I sat at my desk, opening my laptop to review the files I would present to the FBI tomorrow. The investigation had begun 6 months ago with a simple discrepancy: a patient chart that didn't match the treatment documentation submitted to insurance. At first, I'd thought it was a clerical error, something to mention to Ryan over dinner. But something had stopped me. Perhaps it was the distant memory of other small inconsistencies I'd noticed and dismissed over the years. Or maybe it was the growing emotional distance between us, the late nights at the hospital, the mysterious weekend conferences that I couldn't verify when I'd casually checked the Medical Association calendar. So instead of mentioning it to Ryan, I'd dug deeper. One discrepancy became 2, then 5, then a pattern too consistent to be coincidental. Patients with relatively minor cardiac issues receiving aggressive interventions. Procedures documented one way in the hospital records, another way in insurance submissions, and most damning of all, an alarming number of these patients dying from complications, followed by substantial insurance payouts. I'd hired Marcus Williams, a former police detective turned private investigator, who had helped me document the financial side of Ryan's operation. Together, we'd discovered the offshore accounts, the shell companies, the systematic diversion of funds that should have gone to the hospital or patient care. The most difficult part had been maintaining normalcy at home and at work while conducting the investigation. Each morning, I'd put on my lab coat and wedding ring, treating my pediatric patients with the same care and attention I always had, while knowing that in another wing of the same hospital, my husband was effectively sentencing people to death for profit. Each night, I'd come home to prepare dinner, discuss hospital politics, even share our bed, all while gathering evidence that would ultimately destroy him. The compartmentalization had been exhausting but necessary. Ryan could never suspect what I knew. A knock at my apartment door startled me from my thoughts. Glancing at the time, nearly midnight, I approached cautiously, checking the peephole. Claire Reynolds stood in the hallway, her face pale and drawn. I'd met with her 2 weeks ago, sharing my suspicions about her mother's death under Ryan's care. She had provided crucial medical history documentation that proved her mother's condition had been stable before Ryan's revolutionary intervention. I opened the door. "Claire, is everything all right?" "I saw it on the news," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "They're saying Dr. Mitchell was arrested at Cypress Grill. That there's evidence of medical fraud and deliberate harm to patients." Her eyes searched mine. "Is it true? Did he kill my mother for money?" I ushered her inside, closing the door behind her. "Yes," I said simply. There was no point in softening the truth now. "I'm giving my official statement to the FBI tomorrow, but the evidence is comprehensive. Your mother's case is one of the clearest examples." Claire sank onto my sofa, tears streaming down her face. Not the fresh grief of a recent loss, but the complex pain of having suspicions confirmed, of knowing a loved one's death wasn't just tragic, but criminal. "I knew something wasn't right," she whispered. Mom was getting better with the standard medication. Her numbers were improving. Then Dr. Mitchell convinced her to try his new approach, said it would get her back to teaching faster. She looked up at me, anger flashing through her tears. She trusted him. We all did. I sat beside her, taking her hand in mine. "I know, and I'm so sorry I didn't see it sooner." "How could you have known?" Claire asked. "He's your husband." "That's exactly why I should have seen it," I replied, the guilt I'd been suppressing rising to the surface. There were signs, small inconsistencies in things he said, changes in his behavior, the sudden improvement in our finances that he attributed to department bonuses and speaking fees. Claire squeezed my hand. "You did see it, though. Maybe not immediately, but you saw it when others didn't, when the hospital administration was celebrating his innovation and success rates." She was right, in a way. When I'd first approached the hospital's medical director with my concerns, I'd been politely dismissed. Ryan's department was bringing in significant revenue and prestige. His published papers on his cardiac intervention protocol were being cited internationally. No one wanted to believe something sinister lurked beneath the impressive results. "What happens now?" Claire asked, wiping away her tears. "A thorough investigation," I replied, gesturing to my laptop where the files were organized and ready. "Every patient, every procedure, every financial transaction will be examined. The families will be notified. There will likely be civil suits in addition to the criminal charges." "And you? What happens to you?" It was a question I'd avoided, asking myself during the months of investigation. What would my life look like after exposing Ryan? After testifying against my own husband? After the medical community learned that one of their most prominent cardiologists was effectively a serial killer motivated by greed? "I don't know," I admitted. "I can't stay at Westlake Memorial. Too many memories, too many connections to Ryan. I've been talking with Portland Children's about a position in their pediatric department." "You'll be starting over," Claire observed. "In a way," I agreed, "but with a clear conscience." Claire stayed for another hour, looking through some of the evidence I'd gathered, asking questions about her mother's case specifically. When she finally left, she hugged me tightly. "Thank you for being brave enough to find the truth. Mom would have appreciated knowing that justice was coming, even if she isn't here to see it." After she left, I couldn't sleep. The adrenaline from the confrontation at Cypress Grill still coursed through my system. I found myself standing at the window, watching the occasional car pass by on the street below, thinking about the moment. Natalie had appeared at our table, proudly announcing her pregnancy. She had expected tears, anger, humiliation, the typical reaction of a wife confronted with her husband's infidelity. She couldn't have known that I'd already moved beyond that, pain to something much larger, that her revelation was nothing compared to what I was about to unveil. My phone buzzed again, a news alert this time. Ryan's arrest was now public, the initial details of the investigation being reported. The article mentioned alleged medical fraud and financial impropriety, but stopped short of connecting the procedures to patient deaths. That would come later, once the full scope of the evidence was reviewed. I wondered how many of his colleagues were reading the same article right now, shocked and disbelieving, unable to reconcile the respected Dr. Ryan Mitchell with the criminal described in the news. How many were checking their own patient records, reviewing cases where they had followed his protocols or recommendations? How many were wondering if they had unwittingly participated in his schemes? The sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn when I finally lay down, exhaustion overtaking me. My last thought before sleep claimed me was of the patients who had died: Linda Garvey, Michael Chen, Elaine Reynolds, and at least 14 others we had identified so far. Their faces, compiled from photos provided by their families, had become familiar to me during the investigation. In my dreams, they were sitting at tables around us in Cypress Grill, silent witnesses to the unmasking of the man responsible for their deaths. I awoke to the insistent ringing of my phone. Disoriented, I fumbled for it on the nightstand, squinting at the screen. Dr. Thomas Green. "Kate," he said when I answered, his voice grave. "I just saw the news. Is it true?" "Every word," I confirmed, sitting up and running a hand through my tangled hair. "And there's more that hasn't been made public yet." A heavy sigh came through the line. "I taught him, Kate. I wrote his recommendation letter for the cardiology fellowship. I championed his research." "You couldn't have known," I said, echoing Claire's words to me the night before. Ryan was deliberately deceptive. He maintained a perfect public image while hiding his actions. But the protocols he developed, they seemed so promising. The preliminary data he published was selectively presented, I finished for him. He omitted the negative outcomes, altered the mortality statistics. The complete review you conducted of his cases shows the truth. There was a long pause before Thomas spoke again. "The medical board is convening an emergency session this afternoon. They're asking me to participate virtually. Is there anything specific they should know beyond what's in my report?" I thought about the personal side of Ryan's deception, the manipulation, the calculated charm, the way he could make even the most questionable actions seem reasonable and necessary. "Tell them to look beyond the medical and financial records," I advised. Ryan's true skill was in making people trust him completely. He convinced patients to undergo risky procedures, persuaded hospital administrators to approve questionable protocols, charmed financial auditors into overlooking discrepancies. The system didn't just fail to catch him, it actively facilitated his crimes because no one could imagine he was capable of them. "Including you," Thomas said gently. "Especially me," I acknowledged, the admission still painful despite everything. "I built a life with him, Thomas. 15 years. And for at least the last 3, he was deliberately harming patients for profit while coming home to me, attending medical charity events, giving speeches about improving patient outcomes." "Kate," Thomas's voice softened, "you stopped him. When you found evidence of what he was doing, you didn't look away or make excuses. You investigated, you documented, you acted. How many lives did you save by exposing him now, before he could harm more patients?" It was a perspective I hadn't fully considered, too focused on the lives already lost, the families already grieving. But Thomas was right. By stopping Ryan, now, countless future patients had been spared. "Thank you for that," I said quietly. I needed to hear it. After we hung up, I showered and dressed carefully for my FBI interview, choosing a professional Navy suit that projected competence and credibility. Today would set the tone for everything that followed: the investigation, the eventual trial, my own future in medicine. As I gathered the files and external hard drive containing all my evidence, I thought about Ryan sitting in a federal holding cell, his world collapsing around him. Had he realized yet the full extent of what I'd discovered? Did he understand that his medical career was irrevocably over? That his freedom, his reputation, everything he valued was now forfeit? And Natalie, what would happen to her and the baby? The child would be born while Ryan was awaiting trial, would grow up with a father incarcerated for fraud and negligent homicide. Whatever Natalie had imagined when she appeared at our anniversary dinner, it certainly wasn't this. The FBI field office was housed in a nondescript building downtown. Agent Miller met me in the lobby, escorting me to a conference room where Agent Thompson and 2 others waited, an assistant U.S. attorney and a medical expert from the FDA. Dr. Mitchell, Agent Miller began once introductions were complete. We appreciate your cooperation in this matter. We understand this is a difficult situation given your relationship with the subject. My relationship with Ryan doesn't change the facts, I replied, opening my laptop. Everything I've gathered is documented, verified, and corroborated by independent experts. I'm prepared to walk you through all of it. For the next 4 hours, I methodically presented the evidence: the altered patient records, the falsified treatment protocols, the financial transactions tracing insurance payments through various accounts until they landed in Ryan's control. I explained how I'd first noticed discrepancies, how I'd methodically built the case while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. This level of documentation is extraordinary, the assistant U.S. attorney commented, reviewing the timeline I'd constructed of Ryan's activities. Most insider witnesses don't have this kind of comprehensive evidence. I'm a doctor, I explained simply. Thoroughness and attention to detail are professional requirements, and I knew that given Ryan's reputation and status, anything less than irrefutable evidence would be dismissed. You mentioned other doctors who reviewed these cases, the FDA expert said. Dr. Green and Dr. Bennett. Were they aware of the full scope of your investigation? I shook my head. No, I presented them with anonymized patient records, asking for their expert opinion on whether the procedures performed were medically necessary and appropriate, given the documented conditions. I didn't share my suspicions about fraud or financial impropriety. And their conclusions? Both independently determined that in over 80% of the cases, the aggressive interventions were unnecessary and, in many instances, contraindicated, given the patient's actual conditions, I replied, pulling up their written assessments on my laptop. They identified what they termed significant deviations from standard cardiac care protocols and unnecessarily high-risk approaches to manageable conditions. Agent Thompson leaned forward. Dr. Mitchell, did your husband ever indicate awareness that what he was doing was wrong? Any statements or behaviors that suggested guilt or concern about being discovered? I considered the question carefully, thinking back over the past few years. Nothing explicit, I finally said. But there were changes in his behavior, increased secrecy about his work, defensiveness when questioned about treatment decisions, a preoccupation with the department's financial metrics rather than patient outcomes. I paused, a memory surfacing. There was one incident, about 8 months ago. A patient's family, the Donovans, questioned Ryan's recommendation for an aggressive intervention, seeking a second opinion from another cardiologist. Ryan was uncharacteristically angry about it, calling them difficult and medically naive. When the second opinion contradicted his recommendation, suggesting a more conservative approach, Ryan became obsessed with discrediting the other doctor. The patient ultimately went with the conservative treatment plan and is doing well today. We'll need to speak with that family, Agent Miller noted, writing down the name. They're already on the list I provided, I confirmed. The Donovans may be the only patients who escaped Ryan's scheme because they questioned his authority. The interview continued, covering every aspect of Ryan's activities, his professional history, the development of his innovative protocols, the timeline of when the fraudulent practices began and how they escalated. "One final question, Dr. Mitchell," the assistant U.S. attorney said as the interview concluded. "Why do you believe your husband engaged in these activities? In your assessment, what was his primary motivation?" It was the question I'd asked myself countless times during the investigation, lying awake at night next to the man I was systematically exposing. What had transformed the dedicated, compassionate doctor I'd married into someone capable of deliberately harming patients for financial gain? "Initially, I think it was about recognition and prestige," I said slowly. Ryan always wanted to be at the forefront of cardiac medicine, to be known for innovation and breakthrough treatments. The department was underfunded compared to other prestigious cardiology programs, limiting his ability to conduct the research he wanted. I took a deep breath, organizing my thoughts. I believe he started by exaggerating the success rates of his treatments to secure more funding and attention. When that worked, the financial incentives became apparent. Higher risk procedures meant higher insurance reimbursements. The patients who survived became success stories he could publish. Those who didn't were classified as unavoidable complications. And once he saw how profitable it could be, Agent Thompson prompted. The scope expanded, I confirmed. More aggressive interventions, higher risk patients, larger insurance policies. It became a systematic operation, especially after he hired Natalie Porter to manage the department's finances. She had the expertise to structure the transactions in ways that would avoid obvious red flags. "Do you believe Ms. Porter was aware of the fraudulent nature of these activities?" the attorney asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "The evidence suggests she understood the financial side, moving money through various accounts, establishing the offshore holdings. But whether she knew those funds came from deliberately harmful medical procedures rather than legitimate treatment is unclear. Their personal relationship may have clouded her professional judgment." As the interview concluded, Agent Miller walked me out. "We've scheduled an interview with Ms. Porter for this afternoon," he informed me. "Based on preliminary questioning, she's claiming complete ignorance of the medical aspects of Dr. Mitchell's scheme." "That's plausible," I acknowledged. Ryan was skilled at compartmentalizing information, only sharing what people needed to know to fulfill their role in his plans. "And yet you uncovered everything," Agent Miller observed. "I had the advantage of knowing him better than anyone," I replied, "and of having access to both the medical and financial sides of his life. Most importantly, I knew what to look for once I saw the first signs something was wrong." 6 months later, I sat in my new office at Portland Children's Hospital, having accepted the position of Chief of Pediatrics after leaving Westlake Memorial. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows as I reviewed the day's patient schedule. My phone buzzed with a news alert. Prominent cardiologist sentenced to 18 years for fraud and negligent homicide. The article detailed how Ryan had pleaded guilty to multiple counts of fraud and negligent homicide, his legal team unable to counter the mountain of evidence I'd gathered. His medical license had been permanently revoked, his assets seized to provide restitution to the families of his victims. A knock at my door drew my attention. Claire Reynolds stood there, holding a bouquet of flowers. Her mother had been one of Ryan's victims, a 59-year-old teacher whose minor heart condition had been aggressively treated with an experimental procedure that resulted in her death. "Dr. Mitchell," she said softly, "I wanted to thank you personally. The settlement won't bring Mom back, but knowing that he can't hurt anyone else..." She trailed off, emotion choking her words. "Please, call me Kate," I replied, gesturing for her to sit. "And thank you for your testimony. It made a difference." Claire placed the flowers on my desk, blue and white blooms arranged beautifully. "These were Mom's favorites. She would have been grateful for what you did, risking your career, your reputation, to expose the truth." "It was the right thing to do," I said simply. As doctors, our first obligation is to do no harm. Another text message appeared on my phone, this one from Dr. Sarah Bennett. Ethics Committee implementing new safeguards based on the Mitchell case. Your recommendations were unanimously approved. Change is happening. I smiled at the message, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. The months of investigation, the careful documentation, the sleepless nights, all of it had been worth it to protect future patients from suffering the same fate as Ryan's victims. "What about Natalie?" Claire asked hesitantly. "And the baby?" I sighed, thinking of the young woman who had appeared so triumphantly at our anniversary dinner, unaware she was walking into a storm of her own making. She cooperated fully with investigators. In exchange for her testimony, she received immunity from prosecution. She moved back to Ohio to be near her family. The baby, a girl, was born in February. What I didn't mention was the letter Natalie had sent me after the birth, a photo of the infant enclosed, along with a simple note. She deserves better than the legacy her father left behind. I'm making sure she gets it. My phone rang, the hospital administrator calling about the new safety protocols being implemented across all departments. As I answered, I glanced at the framed quote on my wall, something I'd placed there after the case concluded. The truth is not for all men, but only for those who seek it. The transformation of my professional life had been as dramatic as the upheaval in my personal world. After my testimony at Ryan's preliminary hearing, many colleagues had distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the implications of his crimes, or perhaps questioning their own complicity and not noticing warning signs. Others had reached out in support, commending my courage while privately examining their own departments for similar irregularities. The Portland medical community had been shaken to its core. 3 other physicians at Westlake Memorial had been implicated in Ryan's schemes to varying degrees. A pathologist who had altered autopsy reports, an anesthesiologist who had administered questionable medications during procedures, and a junior cardiologist who had falsified follow-up assessments. "Kate?" Claire's voice pulled me back to the present. "Are you all right?" I smiled apologetically. "Just thinking about how much has changed since that night at Cypress Grill. Sometimes it feels like another lifetime." Claire nodded, understanding. "For what it's worth, the support group you helped establish for the families has been invaluable. Being around others who understand what we're going through, who share the same complex emotions about Dr. Mitchell. And what he did, it's made the healing process easier." The support group had been Marcus Williams's idea. The private investigator had seen the impact of white-collar crime on victims' families before and suggested creating a space where Ryan's victims could connect, share resources, and help each other navigate the complicated legal and emotional aftermath. "I'm glad it's helping," I said sincerely. "How is your father doing?" Claire's expression softened. "Better. He started teaching again at the community college. Having something meaningful to focus on has been good for him. And the settlement will ensure he doesn't have to worry about finances." The settlements had been substantial. Between Ryan's seized assets, insurance payouts, and the hospital's liability coverage, each family had received significant compensation. It couldn't replace their loved ones, but it at least provided financial security during their grief. After Claire left, I turned my attention to my patient files for the afternoon. Working with children had always been my passion, the reason I'd gone into medicine in the first place. There was something pure about pediatric medicine, the clear mission to heal, to protect, to advocate for the most vulnerable patients. I thought about how different my approach to medicine was from what Ryan's had become, where I saw each patient as a whole person deserving of care and respect. He had begun viewing them as financial opportunities, their illnesses as vehicles for profit, their trust as a tool to be exploited. When had that transformation happened? Had there been a specific moment when the dedicated healer I'd married had crossed an ethical line he couldn't return from? Or had it been gradual, a series of small compromises that eventually led to deliberate harm? My afternoon rounds took me through the pediatric oncology wing, where I stopped to speak with each young patient and their families. These conversations, honest, sometimes difficult, always compassionate, were the heart of medicine, the human connection that Ryan had somehow lost sight of. As I finished my notes on the last patient, my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Thought you should know, Dr. Patterson agreed to testify against the others. The whole network is coming down." Dr. James Patterson, the pathologist who had altered autopsy findings to support Ryan's narrative about patient deaths, had initially denied knowledge of the broader scheme. Facing his own criminal charges, he had eventually admitted to being paid to modify reports, classifying preventable deaths as unavoidable complications of pre-existing conditions. His testimony would strengthen the cases against the anesthesiologist and junior cardiologist, ensuring the full scope of the conspiracy was exposed and addressed. No one who had participated in or facilitated Ryan's crimes would escape justice. That evening, I attended a meeting of the hospital's newly formed Ethics Oversight Committee. Following the Mitchell case, as it was now known in medical circles, Portland's major hospitals had established independent committees with authority to investigate suspicious patterns in patient care or financial transactions. "Dr. Mitchell," the committee chair greeted me as I entered the conference room. "Thank you for joining us. Your perspective on early warning signs in the Westlake case has been invaluable in developing our new protocols." The irony wasn't lost. On me, my married name, once a source of pride when associated with my husband's seemingly stellar reputation, now carried weight for an entirely different reason. I'd considered reverting to my maiden name after the divorce was finalized, but ultimately decided against it. Catherine Mitchell was the doctor who had exposed a deadly fraud scheme and helped establish new protections for patients. That legacy was worth preserving. The meeting focused on implementing a new cross-departmental review system where unusual patterns in treatment outcomes or financial transactions would trigger automatic investigation. The system was designed specifically to catch the kind of scheme Ryan had operated, where departments became insular fiefdoms with little outside oversight. "The key is breaking down the isolation between medical practice and financial operations," I explained to the committee. In the Westlake case, the finance department saw only the increasing revenue from the cardiology wing, while the medical staff saw only the innovative protocols being implemented. No one was connecting treatment decisions to financial outcomes at the patient level. "And that's exactly where Dr. Mitchell's scheme operated," the committee chair added. "In that gap between medical decisions and financial results?" As the meeting concluded, Dr. Thomas Green joined via video conference from Chicago, where he was helping Northwestern Memorial implement similar protocols. "Kate," he said when the others had left, "how are you really doing? Beyond the professional accolades and new position?" I considered the question carefully. Few people asked about my personal well-being, most assuming that my professional success after exposing Ryan indicated complete recovery from the trauma of discovering his crimes. "I'm adapting," I said finally. "Some days are easier than others. The work helps, knowing that I'm making a positive difference, that the systems we're putting in place will protect future patients." Thomas nodded understanding. "And personally? Are you healing?" "Slowly," I admitted. "I've started seeing a therapist who specializes in betrayal trauma. It's helping me process not just the end of my marriage, but the fundamental deception at its core. For 15 years, I shared my life with someone capable of deliberately harming vulnerable people for profit. That's not something you just move past." "No, it wouldn't be," Thomas agreed quietly. "I still struggle with my own role, mentoring. Him, promoting his career, championing his supposed innovations. I keep questioning what I missed, what signs I should have seen." "We all do," I assured him. But Ryan was exceptionally skilled at presenting exactly what people expected to see. That's what made him so effective and so dangerous. After the call ended, I drove home through the rain-slicked streets of Portland, the city lights blurring behind sheets of water on my windshield. The rhythmic swish of the wipers provided a hypnotic backdrop for my thoughts, which inevitably returned to that night at Cypress Grill, the moment when two separate deceptions, Ryan's affair with Natalie and his medical fraud scheme, had collided in a perfect storm of revelation. Had Natalie not chosen that night to announce her pregnancy, would I have continued my investigation in secret? Would I have gathered more evidence before confronting Ryan? Or would her dramatic entrance have happened regardless? A confrontation, inevitable once she realized she was carrying the child of a married man. The questions were academic now, the past fixed and unchangeable. What mattered was what came next. The ongoing implementation of safeguards, the support for victims' families, the rebuilding of my own life from the wreckage of Ryan's crimes. At home, I settled on my sofa with a cup of tea, opening my laptop. To review the latest draft of the journal article I was co-authoring with Sarah Bennett, titled Identifying and Preventing Fraud in Medical Practice, Lessons from the Mitchell Case. It detailed the warning signs, system vulnerabilities, and institutional failures that had allowed Ryan's scheme to flourish undetected for years. The article had been difficult to write, requiring me to analyze my own husband's criminal methodology with clinical detachment. But its potential impact made the emotional challenge worthwhile. If it helped even one hospital identify and stop a similar scheme before patients were harmed, the pain of revisiting the case would be justified. My doorbell rang unexpectedly, interrupting my concentration. Glancing at the time, nearly 9 p.m., I approached the door cautiously and checked the peephole. Dr. Sarah Bennett stood in the hallway, rain dripping from her coat, an apologetic smile on her face. "Sorry for showing up unannounced," she said, when I opened the door. "I was at OHSU for a consultation and thought I'd take a chance on catching you at home." "Sarah, come in!" I welcomed her, genuinely pleased by the surprise visit. Over the months of working together on the Mitchell case and its aftermath, she had become more than a colleague, a trusted friend who understood the professional and personal dimensions of what I'd been through. "I brought dinner," she said, holding up a bag from a local Thai restaurant. "Figured you might not have eaten yet." She was right. I'd been so absorbed in the article that food hadn't crossed my mind. "You're a lifesaver," I laughed, taking the bag and leading her to the kitchen. "How was the consultation at OHSU?" "Fascinating case," Sarah replied, removing her wet coat. "They're implementing the cross-verification protocol we designed, and they've already identified 2 procedures that raised red flags. Nothing nefarious, just potential overtreatment due to defensive medicine, but it shows the system works." We settled at my dining table with the food, discussing the ongoing implementation of new safety protocols across various hospitals. Sarah had become the national authority on medical fraud prevention since her involvement in the Mitchell case, consulting with hospital systems across the country. "The article is nearly finished," I told her between bites of pad thai. "I've added the section on institutional culture you suggested, how pressure for innovation and revenue growth can create environments where ethical boundaries blur." Sarah nodded approvingly. "That's crucial. What happened at Westlake wasn't just about Ryan. It was about a system that rewarded apparent success without questioning the methods behind it." "The most disturbing part," I admitted, "was how many people noticed small inconsistencies but dismissed them because of Ryan's reputation and charm. Nurses who thought certain procedures seemed excessive, administrators who noticed unusual billing patterns, even other doctors who questioned his remarkable success rates. They all ultimately deferred to his authority. That's why the new protocols focus on mandatory reporting and independent verification," Sarah said, taking the decision to raise concerns out of individual hands and making it systematic. As we finished dinner, Sarah's expression grew more serious. "Kate, there's something I need to tell you. It's part of why I wanted to see you in person tonight." I tensed involuntarily, preparing for bad news. What is it? I received a letter from Ryan last week, she said carefully, watching my reaction. From federal prison. My stomach tightened. What did he want? To apologize, ostensibly, Sarah replied, her skepticism evident. He claimed to have reflected deeply on his actions and wanted to make amends by offering insights for our article on preventing similar schemes. And you think it's genuine? I asked, already knowing her answer. Sarah shook her head. No, it reads like a calculated attempt to reposition himself as reformed and cooperative, laying groundwork for a potential appeal or early release petition. Classic manipulative behavior. I wasn't surprised. Ryan's ability to adapt his persona to whatever would most benefit him in a given situation had been central to his success, both as a doctor and as a criminal. Did you respond? I asked. Not yet, Sarah admitted. I wanted to discuss it with you first. He's your ex-husband, and this is our joint project. I won't engage with him at all if you're uncomfortable with it. I considered the question carefully. The thought of Ryan attempting to insert himself into the work Sarah and I were doing to prevent future schemes like his was disturbing. Yet, there might be value in understanding his perspective, not for his benefit, but for the integrity of our research. If you do respond, I said finally, make it clear that any information he provides will be used to strengthen protections against medical fraud, not to mitigate his own crimes. And I'd want to review any communication before you send it. Sarah nodded agreement. Of course. To be honest, I doubt he has anything substantive to offer that we haven't already identified through analyzing the evidence. This is likely more about maintaining some sense of control or relevance from prison. The mention of control reminded me of something Marcus had said during our investigation. Men like your husband don't just want money. They want power over patients, over colleagues, over systems. Even when they're caught, they'll try to maintain some form of control over the narrative. Has he tried to contact you directly? Sarah asked gently. No, I replied, relieved that at least Ryan had respected that boundary. The divorce was finalized 3 months ago. His lawyer handled everything. The last time I saw him was at the sentencing hearing. The memory of that day in court was still vivid. Ryan in his prison jumpsuit, a stark contrast to the tailored suits he'd worn throughout our marriage, standing as the judge delivered his sentence. He'd looked at me just once during the proceedings, his expression unreadable, before being led away to begin serving his 18-year sentence. What about Natalie and the baby? Sarah asked, changing the subject slightly. She sends updates occasionally, I said, retrieving my phone to show. Sarah, the most recent photo Natalie had shared. A chubby-cheeked infant with Ryan's distinctive eyes gazed at the camera, her tiny hand clutching a colorful toy. Emma Grace, I explained. She's 4 months old now. Natalie's parents moved to Ohio to help her raise the baby. They've been supportive from what she's told me. Sarah studied the photo, her expression softening. She's beautiful and completely innocent in all of this. That's why I've maintained contact with Natalie, I explained. Emma shouldn't suffer for her father's crimes. When she's older, if she wants to know about her father from someone who knew him before, everything, I'll be there for her. It was a complex decision I'd made after much reflection. To remain a peripheral presence in the life of my ex-husband's child with another woman. Some might have found it strange or masochistic, but to me, it was the final act of healing, a way of ensuring that something positive emerged from the wreckage of Ryan's deceptions. You're an extraordinary person, Kate, Sarah said quietly. Not many could find that kind of compassion after everything you've been through. I shook my head slightly. It's not extraordinary. It's just human. Emma didn't choose any of this. Neither did Natalie, really. She was manipulated by Ryan just as thoroughly as his patients were, just in a different way. Our conversation shifted to lighter topics as the evening progressed. Sarah's recent research, my adjustment to the new position at Portland Children's, mutual colleagues, and the latest medical advances. It felt normal, comfortable, a reminder that life continued beyond trauma and betrayal. After Sarah left, promising to send me her revised sections of the article by the weekend, I found myself thinking about Emma Grace and the future that awaited her. Would she grow up knowing who her father was and what he had done? How would Natalie explain Ryan's absence, his incarceration, the crimes that had put him there? There were no easy answers, no perfect solutions to the ripple effects of Ryan's actions. All any of us could do, Natalie, the victims' families, his former colleagues, myself, was move forward with integrity, making the best choices possible in the aftermath of his destruction. The next morning, I arrived at Portland Children's, earlier than usual, using the quiet hours before rounds to finish my contribution to the article. As I typed the conclusion, summarizing the institutional changes necessary to prevent similar frauds, I felt a sense of closure forming at last. The Mitchell case had become more than a personal tragedy or professional scandal. It had evolved into a watershed moment for medical ethics, a case study in how healthcare systems could be manipulated and how to strengthen them against future exploitation. Something constructive had emerged from the devastation. Concrete. Reforms that would protect vulnerable patients from predatory practitioners. Just as I finished the final paragraph, my assistant knocked on the door. "Dr. Mitchell, there's someone here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's important." "Who is it?" I asked, saving my document and closing the key. "Laptop." "And Dr. Jessica Thompson," my assistant replied. "She says she used to work with your ex-husband at Northwestern Memorial." The name triggered a distant memory. Ryan mentioning a colleague from his fellowship years, someone he'd described as brilliant but unstable, when explaining why he'd lost touch with her. With newfound suspicion about anything Ryan had ever told me, I was immediately curious. "Send her in," I decided, straightening my desk and preparing for whatever this unexpected visitor might bring. Dr. Thompson entered cautiously, a petite woman in her early 40s with intelligent eyes that assessed me quickly. "Thank you for seeing me without an appointment," she said, taking the seat I offered. "I've been following the Mitchell case in the medical journals. Your courage in exposing what was happening is commendable." "Thank you," I replied, studying her curiously. "You worked with Ryan at Northwestern?" "Yes, during his fellowship," she confirmed. "And briefly afterward, before I relocated to Boston. That's actually why I'm here. When I read about his scheme at Westlake, certain irregularities I'd noticed years ago suddenly made sense." My full attention captured, I leaned forward. "What kind of irregularities?" "Patient selection patterns that seemed unusual, aggressive treatment approaches for relatively stable patients, and 3 unexpected deaths during routine procedures." She withdrew a folder from her bag. "I raised concerns at the time, but Ryan's mentor—" "Dr. Green," I supplied, my stomach tightening. She nodded. Dr. Green dismissed my concerns, suggesting I was being overly cautious or perhaps competitive with Ryan, who was clearly the star fellow. Eventually, I was offered a position at Mass General that advanced my career. So I left Chicago and tried to put my suspicions behind me. "Until now," I observed. "Until I read about his conviction and recognize the same patterns on a larger scale," she confirmed, sliding the folder across my desk. "These are my personal notes from that time, along with patient identifiers that could help investigators determine if what happened at Westlake actually began years earlier at Northwestern." I opened the folder, scanning the meticulous notes. That indeed described treatment decisions and outcomes disturbingly similar to what I'd uncovered at Westlake. "Have you shown these to the authorities?" "Not yet," Dr. Thompson admitted. "I wanted to speak with you first. You know him better than anyone, and you were the one who finally saw through his deceptions. I needed to know if my suspicions from all those years ago could be valid, or if I'm projecting backward based on recent revelations. I studied Dr. Thompson's notes with growing apprehension, recognizing patterns that matched Ryan's later activities at Westlake Memorial with disturbing precision. The patient selection, the escalation of interventions, the careful documentation that justified aggressive treatments while obscuring their unnecessary nature. It was all there, just on a smaller scale. These 3 patients who died, I said, pointing to the highlighted cases in her notes. Did they have updated insurance policies? Any unusual financial circumstances? Dr. Thompson nodded grimly. The woman, Eleanor Winters, had recently received a substantial inheritance. The older man, James Kaplan, had increased his life insurance coverage after a minor health scare. And the young teacher, Robert Chen, had just received a settlement from a car accident. I didn't connect these dots at the time. Why would I look into their financial situations? But in retrospect, the pattern was already forming. I finished for her, feeling sick. Ryan's criminal behavior hadn't begun at Westlake as we'd believed. It had started during his fellowship, perhaps as opportunistic exploitation of vulnerable patients, before evolving into the systematic operation I'd uncovered. I've always wondered if I should have pushed harder with my concerns, Dr. Thompson admitted, regret evident in her voice. If I had, maybe those patients at Westlake would still be alive. I shook my head firmly. Ryan was protected by Dr. Green and the institutional prestige of Northwestern. Your concerns would have been buried just as thoroughly as the early warning signs at Westlake were. He was too valuable, too charismatic, too seemingly brilliant to be questioned. Still, I've carried this guilt for years, she said quietly, wondering if I'd abandoned my ethical obligation for career advancement when I took the position at Mass General instead of pursuing my suspicions. I understand guilt better than most, I replied, thinking of my own struggle with having been married to Ryan during the years he was harming patients. But directing it productively is what matters now. These notes could expand the investigation into Ryan's activities, possibly bring justice for more victims, and strengthen the case for systemic reforms. Dr. Thompson straightened in her chair, resolve replacing regret. That's exactly why I came to you. What's the best way to proceed? Should I take these directly to the FBI agents handling the Westlake case? I can arrange that, I offered. Agent Miller has been thorough and compassionate with the victims' families. He'll understand the significance of evidence suggesting Ryan's crimes began earlier than we thought. We spent the next hour reviewing her notes in detail, identifying specific patterns that match the Westlake scheme, and making copies of the most relevant documents. When Dr. Thompson left, she appeared lighter, as though sharing this long-held burden had provided release from years of questioning her own judgment. After she departed, I sat at my desk, staring at the copies she'd left with me, contemplating the implications. If Ryan's criminal activities had begun during his fellowship, how many more victims might there be? How many families were still believing their loved ones had died from unavoidable complications rather than deliberate exploitation? I called Agent Miller immediately, explaining Dr. Thompson's visit and the potential expansion of the investigation. He listened intently, asking clarifying questions about the time frame and potential evidence. This could change the scope significantly, he acknowledged when I'd finished. We focused on Westlake because that's where we had concrete evidence. But if Dr. Mitchell was developing these methods during his fellowship, then there could be a trail of victims across multiple institutions, I completed his thought. Northwestern, the Cleveland Clinic where he did a visiting fellowship, and possibly St. Francis in Portland before he joined Westlake. I'll need to speak with Dr. Thompson as soon as possible, Agent Miller decided, and we'll need to review Dr. Mitchell's complete employment history again, looking for patterns we might have missed. There's something else to consider, I added, a troubling thought forming. If Ryan was already engaging in these activities during his fellowship, Dr. Green may have known more than he's acknowledged. His dismissal of Dr. Thompson's concerns could have been protective rather than merely supportive of a promising fellow. The implication hung in the air that Thomas Green, whom I'd trusted as an ally in exposing Ryan's crimes, might have been complicit in enabling them from the beginning. The possibility felt like another betrayal, another trusted figure potentially compromised by association with Ryan. "We'll look into it," Agent Miller assured me. Delicately, given Dr. Green's cooperation with the Westlake investigation, but thoroughly. After the call ended, I sat in silence, processing this new dimension of Ryan's deception. The man I'd married, whom I'd believed I knew intimately, had been hiding darker secrets than I'd imagined, for longer than I'd suspected. The timeline of his transformation from healer to predator had begun years before I'd even met him. My next appointment arrived, a 5-year-old with a congenital heart condition requiring ongoing care, pulling me back to the present and the positive work I could do now. As I examined the child, answering her mother's questions with patience and clarity, I reminded myself that this was the true essence of medicine. Compassionate care focused entirely on the patient's well-being. Later that afternoon, I received a text from Marcus Williams. FBI expanding investigation based on new evidence. Northwestern Memorial being subpoenaed for records from Mitchell's fellowship years. Green being questioned. "You okay?" Marcus had become more than an investigator during our work together. A friend who understood the personal cost of pursuing justice against someone I had loved. His concern touched me, a reminder that I wasn't navigating this ongoing ordeal alone. "Processing," I texted back honestly. "We'll call you later." That evening, as promised, I called Marcus from my apartment, explaining Dr. Thompson's visit and the potential implications for the broader investigation. "Not entirely surprised," Marcus admitted. "In my experience, people like Ryan don't suddenly start committing crimes mid-career. There are usually earlier experiments, smaller versions of the schemes that later become systematic." "That's what frightens me," I confessed, curling up on my sofa with a glass of wine. "I've been trying to understand when Ryan changed, when the doctor who took an oath to do no harm became someone who would deliberately endanger patients for profit. But what if there was never a transformation? What if this is who he always was, and I simply never saw it?" "That's unlikely," Marcus said gently. "Based on everything we've uncovered, there was an escalation over time. The early cases Dr. Thompson identified seem opportunistic, vulnerable patients with specific financial circumstances Ryan could exploit. The Westlake operation was much more sophisticated and deliberate, with systems in place to identify potential targets, alter records, and hide financial transactions." His analysis made sense, aligning with the evidence we'd gathered. Yet the question remained. Had I ever really known Ryan Mitchell? Or had I fallen in love with a carefully constructed facade designed to advance his career and cover his crimes? "What about Dr. Green?" I asked, changing the focus slightly. "Do you think he knew what Ryan was doing during the fellowship?" Marcus hesitated before answering. "It's possible. Mentors can become blindly protective of promising protégés, overlooking warning signs or rationalizing concerning behaviors. Whether that crossed into active knowledge or complicity is what the FBI will need to determine." The thought that Thomas Green, who had been supportive throughout the Westlake investigation, who had helped strengthen the case against Ryan with his expert analysis of the cardiology protocols, might have enabled the early stages of Ryan's criminal behavior, was deeply unsettling. "I've been speaking with him regularly about the ethics reforms," I said, voicing my concern. "Working with him on implementing new safeguards across hospital systems. If he knew about Ryan's activities from the beginning, then the safeguards may need safeguards," Marcus finished pragmatically, "which is precisely why your perspective is so valuable. You're approaching this with clear eyes, Kate, not institutional loyalty or professional defensiveness." His confidence in me was reassuring. a counterbalance to the self-doubt that occasionally surfaced when I questioned how I could have lived with Ryan for 15 years without recognizing his true nature. The next morning brought news that sent ripples through the medical community. Dr. Thomas Green had been placed on administrative leave from Northwestern Memorial, pending an investigation into his supervision practices during Ryan's fellowship. The hospital's statement emphasized that this was a precautionary measure, not an indication of wrongdoing, but the implication was clear. My phone rang almost immediately. Sarah Bennett calling from Baltimore, her voice tense with concern. "Kate, have you seen the news about Thomas?" "Just now," I confirmed, staring at the announcement on my laptop screen. "I'm still processing it." "This could impact our entire reform initiative," Sarah said, cutting to the practical implications. "Thomas is co-chairing the National Committee on Medical Ethics Reform. If there's any suggestion he was involved in covering up early warning signs about Ryan, then the credibility of the reforms could be compromised," I acknowledged. "We need to get ahead of this, Sarah. The reforms are too important to be derailed by association with any one individual, even Thomas." We spent the next hour developing a contingency plan, restructuring the committee leadership, emphasizing the involvement of patient advocates and independent oversight experts, and preparing a statement affirming the importance of the reforms regardless of potential revelations about individuals involved in their development. As we concluded the call, Sarah hesitated before adding, "Kate, if Thomas did know something about Ryan's activities during the fellowship and chose to ignore it, how will you handle that personally? You've been working closely with him since the Westlake case broke." It was a question I'd been asking myself since Dr. Thompson's visit. "The same way I handled discovering the truth about Ryan," I replied after a moment. "By focusing on the evidence, following it wherever it leads, and prioritizing justice for the patients who were harmed." The answer sounded more confident than I felt. The possibility that Thomas, who had become a mentor and ally in the aftermath of Ryan's exposure, might have enabled the very behavior he'd helped me prosecute, was another potential layer of betrayal, in a situation already laden with deception. Later that morning, I met with the hospital ethics committee to discuss the implications of the expanding investigation. The committee chair, Dr. Eleanor Chen, no relation to the patient Michael Chen, who had died under Ryan's care, addressed the elephant in the room immediately. "I think we all saw the news about Dr. Green," she began, looking around the table. "While we don't know what the investigation will reveal, we need to consider how to proceed with our reforms if there are troubling findings." "The reforms themselves remain sound," I asserted, sharing the strategy Sarah and I had developed. "If anything, this situation underscores why they're necessary. If a physician as respected as Dr. Green potentially overlooked or concealed concerning behaviors from a fellow under his supervision, it demonstrates how deeply institutional protectionism is embedded in medical culture." The committee members nodded in agreement, though I could see the strain in their expressions. Many had known Thomas professionally for years. Some had trained under him or collaborated with him on research. The possibility that he might have enabled Ryan's early crimes was professionally threatening and personally distressing. "We should consider adding another layer to our oversight protocols," suggested Dr. Ramirez, a thoracic surgeon with a background in healthcare ethics. "Something specifically addressing the mentor-mentee relationship and the responsibilities of supervising physicians to report concerning patterns." The discussion that followed was productive, focusing on practical modifications to strengthen the reforms rather than speculation about Thomas's potential culpability. By the end of the meeting, we had drafted additional protocols specifically targeting the supervision of fellows and residents, with clear reporting requirements for concerns about patient selection or treatment decisions. As the committee adjourned, Dr. Chen pulled me aside. "How are you holding up with all this, Kate? It can't be easy having the investigation expand just when you thought things were concluding." Her concern was genuine, reminding me of the supportive community I'd found since exposing Ryan's crimes. While some colleagues had distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the implications or fearful of association with scandal, others had demonstrated remarkable solidarity and compassion. "One day at a time," I replied honestly. "Focusing on the reforms helps. Knowing something positive is emerging from all this." "The Mitchell protocols are going to save lives," Dr. Chen said, using the informal name that had been given to she, the oversight systems developed in response to Ryan's case. "Whatever happens with Dr. Green or any other individual involved, that legacy will endure." The Mitchell protocols, there was irony in the name, a redemptive reclaiming of the Mitchell T, surname that Ryan had tarnished through his crimes. In medical circles, Mitchell was no longer primarily associated with an innovative cardiologist, but with the systematic protections developed to prevent similar abuse of medical authority. That afternoon, I received a call from Agent Miller. "Dr. Mitchell, we've reviewed Dr. Thompson's notes and correlated them with records subpoenaed from Northwestern. There's enough alignment to justify expanding our investigation. We're also looking into Dr. Mitchell's time at the Cleveland Clinic and St. Francis." "And Dr. Green?" I asked, bracing myself for the answer. Agent Miller's voice remained neutral. "We're reviewing all supervision records and correspondence from the fellowship period. Dr. Green is cooperating with investigators. It's too early to draw conclusions about his knowledge or involvement." After the call, I stepped out of my office for a walk around the hospital grounds, needing physical movement to process the continuing revelations. The spring air was fresh, cherry blossoms adding color to the landscaped gardens surrounding Portland Children's. Patients and families strolled the paths or sat on benches, momentary respites from the medical challenges that had brought them here. Watching them, the careful way parents supported children weakened by treatment, the determined steps of recovering patients, the gentle guidance of nurses assisting those who needed help, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was why the Mitchell protocols mattered. This was why exposing Ryan's crimes and preventing similar abuses was worth whatever personal cost came with it. My phone buzzed with a text from Claire Reynolds. "Support group expanded to include Northwestern patients. Families. 3 new members. They're grateful for your help." The support group had grown beyond its original purpose, evolving into an advocacy organization that not only helped families process their grief and anger, but actively participated in developing and promoting patient protection measures. Claire had emerged as a natural leader, channeling her pain over her mother's death into determined activism. I texted back, "Let me know if they need anything. Happy to meet with them when they're ready." The expansion of the investigation meant reliving aspects of the case I'd hoped were behind me, but it also meant more families receiving answers, more victims being acknowledged, and more complete accountability for the harm Ryan had caused. When I returned to my office, I found Dr. Sarah Bennett waiting, having flown in from Baltimore unannounced. "I thought you might need in-person support," she explained when I expressed surprise at seeing her. "This can't be easy, having everything reopened just when you were finding closure." Her thoughtfulness touched me deeply. "Thank you," I said, simply, gesturing for her to sit. "You're right, it's challenging, but necessary if there are more victims who deserve recognition and justice." Sarah nodded, understanding. "I've been thinking about our article. With the investigation expanding to Northwestern and potentially other institutions, we should probably delay publication until we have a more complete picture." "Agreed," I said, having reached the same conclusion. Though the core principles remain valid, the scope of the case study has clearly expanded. We spent the next hour revising our publication timeline and discussing how to incorporate the emerging information without compromising the ongoing investigation. Sarah's practical approach was grounding, helping me focus on concrete actions, rather than becoming overwhelmed by the emotional dimensions of the expanding case. "Have you heard from Thomas directly?" she asked eventually, addressing what we'd both been avoiding. "No," I admitted. "Not since the news broke about his administrative leave. I'm not sure what I would say to him right now, to be honest." Sarah considered this thoughtfully. "It's a difficult position. He's been a key ally in developing the reforms. But if he ignored early warning signs about Ryan's behavior, then he may have enabled the very abuses we're working to prevent." I completed her thought. "And I'd have to question everything. He's contributed to the Mitchell protocols." "Not necessarily," Sarah countered. "Even if, and it's still a significant if, Thomas overlooked concerns during Ryan's fellowship, it doesn't invalidate his expertise or the reforms themselves. People can recognize necessary changes even if they failed to act appropriately in the past." It was a nuanced perspective that I appreciated, a reminder that human behavior rarely falls into simple categories of right and wrong, complicit or innocent. Thomas might have dismissed Jessica Thompson's concerns out of misplaced loyalty to a promising fellow, without understanding the full implications or foreseeing the deadly pattern that would develop. "I suppose we'll need to wait for the investigation's findings," I concluded, "and focus on the work we can continue regardless of what they reveal." That evening, returning to my apartment, I found an unexpected package waiting at my door, a carefully wrapped box with no return address. Cautious after everything that had happened, I examined it thoroughly before opening it, eventually determining it was likely safe. Inside was a journal bound in soft leather, with a note from Natalie Porter. "Found this in Ryan's things when packing up the Cannon Beach house. Thought you should have it. Some answers might be here." My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the journal. Ryan had never been one for personal writing, or so I'd thought. Another assumption about the man I'd married that might prove false. The journal began during his second year of medical school, entries sporadic, but revealing a perspective on medicine I'd never glimpsed during our marriage. While his public persona had always emphasized patient care and medical ethics, his private writings revealed a calculating approach to his career and increasingly disturbing views on patient autonomy. "Finished cardiac rotation today," read an entry from his third year. Fascinating how much trust patients place in their doctors, especially when facing life-threatening conditions. They'll agree to almost anything when scared enough. Something to remember. The casual callousness was jarring, so different from the compassionate healer Ryan had presented himself to be. As the journal continued through his residency and early fellowship, this disconnection between public persona and private perspective widened. Most disturbing were entries about specific patients who had died during his fellowship, including the 3 Dr. Thompson had identified. Ryan's notes were clinical, detached, focusing on the financial circumstances and insurance details rather than the human lives lost. EW procedure successful from financial perspective. Insurance processing uncomplicated. Green questioned approach, but accepted explanation read aggressive intervention. Will refine documentation for next case. I closed the journal, feeling physically ill. Here was confirmation, in Ryan's own handwriting, that his criminal behavior had indeed begun during his fellowship. More troublingly, it suggested Thomas Green had questioned his methods, but ultimately accepted his explanations, possibly overlooking red flags that might have prevented future deaths. After taking a moment to collect myself, I called Agent Miller. "I have something you need to see," I told him, explaining Natalie's package and the journal's contents. "This appears to be contemporaneous documentation of Ryan's early activities, including references to Dr. Green's supervision." "That could be significant evidence," Agent Miller replied, his professional tone not quite hiding his excitement at this development. "I'll send someone to collect it immediately. Did you read much of it?" "Enough to confirm Dr. Thompson's concerns about Ryan's fellowship activities," I answered truthfully, "and enough to suggest Dr. Green may have had reasons to question Ryan's methods, though it's unclear from these entries how much he actually knew or suspected." After arranging for the journal to be collected, I sat in my darkened living room, wrestling with the implications of what I'd read. The Ryan who had written those cold, calculating entries was unrecognizable compared to the man I thought I'd married, or was he? Had there been signs all along that I'd missed or dismissed? I recalled moments from our marriage that had occasionally given me pause. Ryan's dismissive comments about certain patients, his impatience with those who questioned, his recommendations, his focus on recognition and financial rewards rather than patient outcomes. At the time, I'd attributed these to normal professional frustrations or ambition. Now, they seemed like glimpses of his true nature, breaking through the carefully maintained facade. The next morning brought news that Thomas Green had resigned from Northwestern Memorial, citing a desire to fully cooperate with the ongoing investigation without creating distractions for the institution. His statement neither admitted wrongdoing nor claimed innocence, instead focusing on the importance of thorough review of supervision practices in medical education. Sarah called as soon as the news broke. "This changes the dynamic significantly," she observed. "A resignation at this stage suggests he's anticipating problematic findings. Or he's genuinely prioritizing the institution and the investigation over his position," I countered, still reluctant to condemn someone who had been supportive throughout the Westlake case. The journal entries I saw were suggestive but not conclusive about his knowledge. "Speaking of the journal," Sarah said, "Agent Thompson called me this morning. They're treating it as significant evidence and expediting forensic analysis to confirm authenticity. If verified, it could substantiate allegations about Ryan's activities during his fellowship and potentially implicate others who were aware of concerning patterns." The investigation was gathering momentum, expanding beyond what any of us had initially anticipated when I first discovered discrepancies in Ryan's patient records at Westlake. What had begun as one doctor's fraudulent scheme was revealing broader, systemic vulnerabilities in how medical institutions supervised trainees, reviewed treatment decisions, and responded to concerns about aggressive interventions. Later that day, I met with Claire Reynolds and 2 family members of patients who had died during Ryan's fellowship at Northwestern. Unlike the Westlake victims, these families had spent years believing their loved ones had received appropriate care from a promising young cardiologist. Learning now that their deaths might have been part of a deliberate scheme for financial gain reopened grief that had never fully healed. "We trusted the hospital," said Michael Winters, Eleanor Winters' son. "When they told us Dr. Mitchell had done everything possible but the complications were too severe, we believed them. We never questioned whether the procedure itself was necessary or appropriate." "That's what makes this type of medical fraud so insidious," I explained gently. "It exploits the fundamental trust between patients and their doctors, especially in specialties like cardiology, where the conditions are frightening and the treatments complex." "Did you ever suspect anything during your marriage?" asked Sandra Kaplan, James Kaplan's daughter, her voice holding no accusation but genuine curiosity. "Were there signs that something wasn't right?" It was a question I'd been asked many times since Ryan's arrest, one I'd asked myself countless nights. There were moments that gave me pause, I admitted. Comments or attitudes that seemed inconsistent with the compassionate doctor he presented himself to be. But nothing that pointed clearly to deliberate harm or fraud. Ryan was exceptionally skilled at compartmentalizing his life and presenting exactly what people expected to see. Colleagues, patients, even his wife. The meeting continued for over an hour, the families sharing memories of their loved ones and their experiences with Ryan during his fellowship. Their stories provided additional context for the timeline we were constructing of Ryan's evolution from opportunistic exploitation to systematic fraud. As they prepared to leave, Claire handed me an envelope. "The support group wanted you to have this," she said. "It's becoming something more formal, a patient advocacy organization focused on preventing medical fraud and supporting families affected by it. We've named it Project Transparency." Inside the envelope was a certificate of appreciation, acknowledging my role in exposing Ryan's crimes and helping develop protections to prevent similar abuses. The organization's mission statement emphasized transparency in medical decision-making, patient education about treatment options, and independent oversight of high-risk interventions. "This means more to me than any professional recognition," I told Claire sincerely, touched by the gesture. "Knowing something positive is emerging from all this pain. It's already making a difference," she assured me. 3 hospitals have implemented the Mitchell protocols ahead of national requirements. Families are asking more questions about recommended procedures. Medical students are receiving specific training on recognizing and reporting ethical concerns. The concrete impacts Claire described reinforced my conviction that exposing Ryan's crimes, despite the personal and professional cost, had been unequivocally the right decision. Whatever further revelations might emerge as the investigation expanded, the fundamental outcome, protecting future patients from similar exploitation, remained worthwhile. That evening, as I prepared for bed, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Answering cautiously, I was surprised to hear Thomas Green's voice. "Kate," he began, sounding tired and strained. "I hope it's all right to call. I wanted to speak with you directly before things progress further with the investigation." "I'm listening," I replied neutrally, unsure what to expect from this conversation. "I've been reviewing my supervision records from Ryan's fellowship years," Thomas continued, "and reflecting on Dr. Thompson's concerns that I dismissed at the time. I need to acknowledge that I failed in my responsibility as a mentor and supervisor." The admission was startling in its directness. "Are you saying you knew what Ryan was doing?" I asked, needing clarity. "Not the full extent," Thomas clarified. "I didn't realize he was deliberately selecting patients based on their financial circumstances, or that he was personally profiting from unnecessary procedures. But I did notice he was consistently recommending aggressive interventions for patients whose conditions might have responded to more conservative approaches." "And you didn't investigate further?" I pressed, a knot forming in my stomach. Thomas sighed heavily. I rationalized it as the confidence of a brilliant young doctor pushing boundaries in cardiac care. When outcomes were positive, I saw innovation. When they weren't, I accepted his explanations about unavoidable complications. I allowed his charisma and apparent success to cloud my judgment. The explanation was both believable and profoundly disappointing. Thomas hadn't been actively complicit in Ryan's crimes, but he had failed in his duty to scrutinize concerning patterns, potentially enabling Ryan to refine his methods and eventually expand his scheme at subsequent institutions. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, struggling to reconcile this admission with the Thomas who had been so supportive throughout the Westlake investigation. "Because you deserve the truth," he replied simply, "and because I've provided a complete statement to the FBI detailing my supervision failures. The Mitchell protocols we've been developing are partly my attempt at atonement, at ensuring other mentors don't make the same mistakes I did." The conversation continued for another half hour, Thomas explaining his perspective on Ryan's fellowship years and expressing profound regret for not taking Dr. Thompson's concerns more seriously. By the time we concluded the call, I felt a complex mixture of disappointment, understanding, and cautious respect for his willingness to acknowledge his failures. The next morning, the journal Ryan had kept during his fellowship was authenticated by forensic experts, confirming its value as evidence in the expanding investigation. Agent Miller called to update me, his voice reflecting the significance of this development. "The journal provides critical insights into when and how Dr. Mitchell's criminal behavior developed," he explained. "Combined with Dr. Green's statement about supervision failures and Dr. Thompson's contemporaneous notes, we now have a comprehensive picture of the fellowship period." "And the other institutions?" I asked. "Cleveland Clinic and St. Francis?" "We're seeing similar patterns," Agent Miller confirmed. though the schemes became more sophisticated over time. By the time he reached Westlake, Dr. Mitchell had refined his methods significantly, integrating financial operations more thoroughly with medical decision-making. The investigation was, now spanning nearly a decade of Ryan's career, identifying victims at multiple institutions and revealing systemic vulnerabilities that had allowed his schemes to flourish undetected. The implications extended far beyond one doctor's criminal behavior to fundamental questions about oversight in medical practice. That afternoon, I met with the editorial board of the New England Journal of Medicine to discuss publishing an expanded version of the article Sarah and I had been developing. With the investigation now encompassing multiple institutions and a longer time frame, the journal editors recognized the significance of documenting the case comprehensively as a resource for medical education and ethics training. We believe this case study could become foundational in how we teach medical ethics and fraud prevention, the editor-in-chief explained. The detailed evolution from isolated exploitation to systematic fraud, the institutional factors that enabled it, and the reforms developed in response create a powerful educational tool. The meeting was productive, resulting in plans for a special issue focused on medical fraud prevention, with our expanded article as the centerpiece. The issue would include perspectives from ethics experts, hospital administrators, patient advocates, and regulatory authorities, creating a multifaceted examination of how healthcare systems could be strengthened against similar abuses. As I left the meeting, my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. New developments. Call when you can. Finding a quiet corner in the hospital atrium, I called him immediately. What's happening? The FBI just expanded the investigation again, Marcus reported. They're looking into potential accomplices beyond Natalie Porter. Apparently, Ryan's journal mentions a pathologist at Cleveland Clinic who helped falsify post-procedure findings in exchange for research funding. The news was disturbing, but not entirely surprising. As Ryan's schemes had grown more sophisticated, he would have needed additional collaborators in key positions to maintain the facade of legitimate medical practice while concealing the true nature of his interventions. Any names mentioned? I asked, wondering if I would recognize anyone from Ryan's descriptions of colleagues over the years. Dr. Victor Mercer, Marcus said, currently chief of pathology at University Hospital in Chicago. The FBI is executing search warrants at his office and residence today. The name was vaguely familiar. Ryan had mentioned him occasionally as a research collaborator, though I'd never met him personally. Another professional connection that now appeared in a sinister new light. This is becoming much larger than we initially thought, I observed, the implications still unfolding. Not just one doctor's fraudulent practices, but a network of enablers and accomplices across multiple institutions. That's exactly why your work on the Mitchell protocols is so important, Marcus replied. This isn't just about Ryan anymore. It's about identifying and addressing vulnerabilities in the entire system that allowed someone like him to operate for so long without detection. His perspective reinforced what I'd been coming to understand throughout this expanding investigation, that exposing Ryan's crimes was only the beginning of a much larger process of reform and accountability in medical practice. Later that week, I received an unexpected call from Dr. Jessica Thompson, who had become a consultant to the FBI's investigation into Ryan's fellowship activities at Northwestern. They've identified 16 potential victims during the fellowship period, she reported, her voice somber. Patients who received unnecessary procedures, whose outcomes were significantly worse than would be expected with standard care, and who had financial circumstances that benefited Dr. Mitchell in some way. 16, I repeated, the number striking me as both horrifyingly high for a fellowship period and disturbingly low compared to the lives Ryan had impacted over his full career. Have the families been notified? That process is beginning now, Dr. Thompson confirmed. I've been asked to participate in some of those conversations, given my early concerns and familiarity with the cases. I thought you might have advice on approaching these discussions based on your experience with the Westlake families. We spent nearly an hour discussing strategies for communicating with families who were about to learn that their loved ones' deaths or complications may have been the result of deliberate medical fraud rather than unavoidable circumstances. The conversation was difficult but necessary, focusing on honesty, compassion, and practical support for people whose grief would be complicated by these revelations. As the call concluded, Dr. Thompson expressed what many in the medical community were feeling. "I keep thinking about how many opportunities there were to stop this." During his fellowship, at Cleveland Clinic, at St. Francis, before he ever reached Westlake. How many colleagues noticed concerning patterns but didn't speak up, or spoke up but weren't heard? How many administrative reviews missed? Red flags because the revenue numbers looked good? "That's exactly what the Mitchell protocols are designed to address," I replied. "Creating systems where concerns can't be dismissed by a single authority figure, where patterns are identified across departments and institutions, where financial incentives are separated from treatment decisions." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.